welcome to the course Unit 2, the Human Rights Education by the attorney Glinda B. Trinidad. This is her PowerPoint. So, week 2 topics, we're going to talk about what is human rights. So, before we start, we need to watch this one para magkaroon tayo ng preview. Ano nga ba ang human rights?
Human rights. What are human rights? Well, rights are the values which keep society fair, just and equal. They protect children, the elderly, people in care, victims of domestic violence, people with mental health problems, religious groups, teachers, soldiers, and yes, prisoners. They protect all of us. They protect you. Our human rights are protected by law. That means we can do something if our rights are attacked. But not everyone loves human rights. Some want to water them down, even scrap them. Our rights are under threat, so it's time to get educated. Societies used to be controlled by all-powerful rulers who could be horribly unjust. Kings only gave rights to people they liked. Over thousands of years, people fought for equality, and with every hard-won right came new laws that improved how we lived. But in the 20th century, brutal dictators came to power. They ruled by fear, like the kings of the past. Those hard-won rights, they were dismantled on an unimaginable scale. After World War II, the democracies got together and said, never again. They created a simple document setting out the basic rights we all need to live a dignified life. The European Convention puts rights, not rulers, at the heart of our society. Like the right to life, to liberty, to free speech. Then, in 1998, Parliament passed the Human Rights Act, which made our human rights part of UK law. This means public bodies like hospitals and schools must respect our rights, and if they don't, we can go to our local court to enforce them. Now, because of human rights, patients in hospitals must be treated with compassion. Journalists cannot be forced to reveal their sources. Soldiers must be given proper equipment. Gay people have to be treated equally, and the police cannot keep our DNA forever if we're innocent. We have to be treated fairly, at work, at home, in school, anywhere, everywhere. Our human rights are hard-won. They're part of our British heritage. We are proud of them. If we lose them, vulnerable people will pay the biggest price. Know your rights. Celebrate them. Protect them. Share this video if you think human rights. What are human rights? Well, human rights are the values.
So, konti pa, isa pa. Alam ko naman na hindi pa naintindihan ng iba.
Nakamute po.
Okay? So, isa pa, sabi ko. Okay. Alam ko naman yung iba hindi pa naintindihan. Ano nga ba ang human rights? Anyone? Based dun sa video na napanood nyo, ano nga ba ang human rights? Sabi niya, ito yung mga karapatang pangtao na alin, na kailanman ay hindi pwedeng tanggalin. Ano pa? Saan ba tayo nagsimula? Kailan ba natin na naisip na dapat lahat ng karapatang pangtao ay ito na? So, let's watch this again for more information about human rights.
Alam mo ba kung anong nangyari noong 1948? Malamang ay panahon pa yon ng mga lolo't lola mo. Pero sa pagkakaalam ko, kung 70 years ago yon, ito yung tinatawag nilang panahon ng... hindi ng dinosaurs. Panahon ng Hapon, kakatapos pa lang ng World War II. Ang daming naghirap at namatay. Isa sa pinakagrabing pangyayari sa kasaysayan ng mundo. Naghanap ng kasunduan sa pagitan ng mga bansa para matiyak na hindi na mauulit ang mga pangyayari noon at magkaroon ng iisang simbolo ng pagkakaisa, ang Universal Declaration of Human Rights o UDHR. Nagkasundo ang UN General Assembly tungkol dito kaya't isinalin sa napakaraming lengguwahe ang UDHR. Pero ano nga ba ang human rights? Simple, ang human rights ay mga karapatan mo dahil ikaw ay isang tao. Ang ibig sabihin mula nang ipinanganak ka, meron ka ng human rights. Lahat ay pantay-pantay sa pagkamit nito. Kagaya ng ibang pangangailangan mo, mahalaga ang mga ito para mabuhay ka ng maayos. Kung walang human rights, wala ka na ring proteksyon. May mga ibang taong nakulong o nabitay dahil lang sa Facebook status. May 30 articles ang UDHR. May mga civil and political rights tulad ng karapatang mabuhay, bumoto, karapatang magpahayag, at hindi matorture. Ang bawat karapatan ay may kinalaman sa ibang mga karapatan. Hindi ito pwedeng tingi. Pag inalis ang isang karapatan, maaapektuhan ng iba. Halimbawa, kung wala kang bahay, nakatira ka sa kalsada, hindi ka makatulog o makakain ng maayos, magkakasakit ka. Hindi ka pwedeng pumasok sa school, hindi ka rin makakahanap ng trabaho. Ang paglabag sa karapatan mo sa isang maayos na bahay ay paglabag sa iba mo pang mga karapatan para mabuhay ng maayos. Ito yung tinatawag na Economic, Social at Cultural Rights. Nagkasundo ang maraming bansa sa UDHR. Pero sino nga ba dapat ang nangangalaga nito? Sa totoo lang, gobyerno dapat ang nagtitiyak na naibibigay ang lahat ng mga karapatan. Pero madalas, mayroong mga gobyernong lumalabag dito. At dahil ito ay isa lamang deklarasyon, madami ang hindi sumusunod. Pero madami na din naman ang naglagay ng human rights sa kanilang mga konstitusyon, kaya dapat tiyakin na maibibigay ang mga ito. Maiintindihan mo ang iyong mga karapatan sa pamamagitan ng pag-alam sa mga ito. Pero para matiyak ang karapatan mo, kailangan mo ring magbantay na ang karapatan ng iba ay hindi inaabuso o nilalabag. Manindigan ka para sa karapatan mo at karapatan ng iba. Dahil karapatang pantao ay para sa lahat.
So, ayun. So, anyone can tell me ano ang nabuo sa utak nyo? Ha? Ano ang nabuo sa utak nyo? Or ano ang naging parang perception nyo about human rights? Anyone? So, human rights, diba? It refers to the norms that aims to protect people from political, legal, and social abuses. Sabi nga dun sa video, malalaman natin, madami tayong human rights, but the problem is, hindi natin alam. So, paano natin malalaman yon? Pag-aralan natin. Okay? Sabi nga dun sa video, pagkasilang pa lang, meron ka ng human right. That is your right to live. Diba? So, sabi nga niya, human rights, what ang ginagawa niya? It aims to protect the people or us from what? From any type of abuses such as the political, legal, and the social abuses. Human rights are commonly understood as inalienable fundamental rights. Pag nakita nyo ang word na inalienable and fundamental rights, it means hindi pwedeng tanggalin sa inyo. Hindi pwedeng bawiin ninuman. Okay? Ito ang basic rights na meron ka, to which a person is inherently entitled simply because she or he is human being. Therefore, in simple terms, it only means that human rights are what? Entitled to all of us once we are born. Hindi siya privilege lang. Okay? Sa'yo talaga yan. Once you are, what? Simply being human being. Diba? Unless hindi ka tao, wala kang human rights. Unless animals ka, siguro animal rights yun. Diba? So, human rights allow a person to live with dignity and in peace, away from the abuses that can be inflicted by abusive institutions or individuals. Pero ma'am, bakit po kaya still may abuses? Sabi ko nga kanina, hindi naman po ang ating human rights ay hindi siya batas talaga yung sinusundan natin. This is just only a UN declarations wherein pwedeng i-adapt or hindi i-adapt ng isang bansa. So, the United Nations, ito talaga ang nagsimula kung bakit meron tayong universal na Declaration of Human Rights. United Nations defines human rights as universal. Universal, ibig sabihin, pwede lahat, diba? And inalienable, ibig sabihin, hindi pwedeng kuhanin ni naman. Interdependent and indivisible and equal and non-discriminatory. So, lahat to, iisa-isahin natin yung mga characteristics ng ating human rights. This is the definition given by the United Nations. So, let's watch this. This is a video coming from the United Nations.
From the start of our lives, because we are human beings, there are certain things our governments must do to help us reach our potential. These expectations and claims we have of our governments are called human rights. Every single man, woman and child has them. Rights call on governments to respect, avoid putting limits on some things that a person can do. Protect, safeguard a person from abuse. Fulfill, to provide basic conditions to enable a person to achieve their potential. The most basic minimum human rights standards have been discussed and written down by countries. Countries have agreed to follow them. These have become international law. An example where human rights can be found at home is in the Constitution. Promoting respect for basic rights is one of the main purposes of the United Nations. This is achieved through activities of United Nations organisations around the world. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights is responsible for leading the UN's Human Rights Programme. There are also committees of experts that monitor how well countries put their human rights promises into practice. And there is an assembly of countries called the Human Rights Council, which discusses different human rights topics and situations from around the world. Find out what your rights are, learn more about the UN Human Rights Programme, and spread the word. Visit ohchr.org.
That is human rights. So, according to the United Nations. Sabi nga niya, it builds with
Ma'am,
respect.
nakamute po kayo.
Okay, sorry. So, again, that is human rights. Okay? Sabi nga dun sa video, okay? It is built with the respect, dignity, all of its rights natin. So, yung iba, inadapt yung UN Declaration by accepting or parang nilalagay nila sa ating Bill of Rights. Sa atin, di ba, sa Philippine Constitution, nakalagay siya sa Article 3. Okay, the Bill of Rights. So, what are the characteristics ba ng ating human rights? So, number one, it is inherent. So, pag sinabi natin inherent, it is not granted by any person or authority. Walang nag-grant yan sa'yo. Automatically, sa'yo yan. Hindi yan pinapamana, hindi mo na pinapasa. That is automatic sa'yo. Next, it is fundamental. Mga basic characteristics lang to ng human rights, ha? Pag sinabi natin fundamentals, this is the basic right, or without them, sabi nga niya, the life and dignity of man will be meaningless. That's why kailangan siya. Diba? Kaya nga sinabi niya fundamental, ito yung basic knowledge mo, ito yung basic na pangangailangan mo. Next thing is inalienable. Bakit siya inalienable? It cannot be rightfully taken away from a free individual unless there is a specific situations call for it. However, the deprivation of person's rights is a subject to due process. It cannot be given away or be forfeited. Ano ang perfect example ng inalienable? Can you give me one? So, one example of inalienable na tinutukoy niya dyan, for example, is yung death penalty. Do we have the right to life sa human rights? Do we have? Yes, we have, diba? Pero, paano nagiging inalienable, ma'am? Diba sabi mo, isa sa characteristics ng human rights, it is inalienable. It cannot be rightfully taken away from free individual. Kaya nga sabi niya, kung ang isang karapatan ng tao na mabuhay ay aalisin sa iyo, anong kailangan? It is subject to due process. What is due process? This is where the suspect or the offender will undergo the criminal justice system at aalamin ano ba ang nangyari, bakit siya aalisin sa kanya. Kaya nga sabi niya, human rights is inalienable. It cannot be rightfully taken away from a free individual unless specific situations call for it. Ganun lang siya. Next, human rights is universal. Pag sinabi natin universal sa mga charger nga, di ba, meron tayong universal charger. Ibig sabihin, kahit saan phone na pwede siya. Universal applies irrespective of one's origin, status, or condition or place where one lives. Rights can be enforced without national borders. Ang sinasabi niya dito, ang human rights is universal. Therefore, applicable siya sa lahat. At basta ang basic requirement lang ito ay tao ka. Yun lang siya. Next is imprescriptible. It cannot be lost, diba? even if man fails to use or assert them, even by a long passage of time. Hindi porket matanda ka na, wala ka ng right to live. Ganyan. Hindi porket, dati pa po yung human rights, tumanda na ako, wala na yan. Sabi nga niya, it cannot be lost, even if man fails to use or assert them. Gamitin mo man or hindi mo gamitin, that is your rights. Next, it is indivisible. What is indivisible? Not capable of being divided. Holy sa'yo yan. Okay? Cannot be denied even when other rights have already been enjoyed. Sa buhay na lang. Okay? Pwede mo bang hatiin ang buhay mo para sa kanya? O sige, 25 years akong buhay, ikaw din 25 years. Pwede ba yon? Hindi. Diba? So, it is indivisible. So, what are the human rights? Ito, universal human rights ang tinutukoy ng video na to. Let's watch this one.
The idea of human rights is that each one of us, no matter who we are or where we are born, is entitled to the same basic rights and freedoms. Human rights are not privileges, and they cannot be granted or revoked. They are inalienable and universal. That may sound straightforward enough, but it gets incredibly complicated as soon as anyone tries to put the idea into practice. What exactly are the basic human rights? Who gets to pick them? Who enforces them, and how? The history behind the concept of human rights is a long one. Throughout the centuries and across societies, religions, and cultures, we have struggled with defining notions of rightfulness, justice, and rights. But one of the most modern affirmations of universal human rights emerged from the ruins of World War II with the creation of the United Nations. The treaty that established the UN gives as one of its purposes to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. And with the same spirit, in 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This document, written by an international committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, lays the basis for modern international human rights law. The Declaration is based on the principle that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. It lists 30 articles recognizing, among other things, the principle of non-discrimination and the right to life and liberty. It refers to negative freedoms, like the freedom from torture or slavery, as well as positive freedoms, such as the freedom of movement and residence. It encompasses basic civil and political rights, such as freedom of expression, religion, or peaceful assembly, as well as social, economic, and cultural rights, such as the right to education and the right to freely choose one's occupation and be paid and treated fairly. The Declaration takes no sides as to which rights are more important, insisting on their universality, indivisibility, and interdependence. And in the past decades, international human rights law has grown, deepening and expanding our understanding of what human rights are and how to better protect them. So if these principles are so well developed, then why are human rights abused and ignored time and time again all over the world? The problem, in general, is that it is not at all easy to universally enforce these rights or to punish transgressors. The UDHR itself, despite being highly authoritative and respected, is a declaration, not a hard law. So when individual countries violate it, the mechanisms to address those violations are weak. For example, the main bodies within the UN in charge of protecting human rights mostly monitor and investigate violations. But they cannot force states to, say, change a policy or compensate a victim. That's why some critics say it's naive to consider human rights a given in a world where state interests wield so much power. Critics also question the universality of human rights and emphasize that their development has been heavily guided by a small number of mostly Western nations to the detriment of inclusiveness. The result? A general bias in favor of civil political liberties over socio-political rights and of individual over collective or groups' rights. Others defend universal human rights laws and point at the positive role they have on setting international standards and helping activists in their campaigns. They also point out that not all international human rights instruments are powerless. For example, the European Convention on Human Rights establishes a court where the 47 member countries and their citizens can bring cases. The court issues binding decisions that each member state must comply with. Human rights law is constantly evolving, as are our views and definitions of what the basic human rights should be. For example, how basic or important is the right to democracy or to development? And as our lives are increasingly digital, should there be a right to access the internet? A right to digital privacy? What do you think?
So that's it. That is the reason behind, di ba? Kung bakit kahit universal ang ating human rights, bakit ma'am yung ibang bansa pinapatupad pa rin ang itong gantong batas? Kasi hindi naman po lahat ay inadapt ang ating UN Declaration. Ilang bansa nga lang ba ang included sa ating United Nations? It is just only 200 plus lang sila. So, hindi po lahat ng bansa ay kabilang sa ating United Nations. Also, ang sabi nga nila, ang ating human rights, it is only a declaration, not a hard law. That is why meron lang silang karapatan, ng kumilatis or sulatan ng isang presidente or sino man ang administrasyon ng isang bansa tungkol dun sa mga pinapatupad niyang batas. Pero anong gagawin? It can be moved into trash kung ayaw namang ayusin ng isang bansang demokratiko. So, that is the reason behind between that characteristic na kahit universal siya, hindi po siya ganon kalakas. So, next, it is equal and non-discriminatory. So, human rights protect all people regardless of race, nationality, gender, religion, and political leaning, among others. They should be respected without prejudice. So, equal and non-discriminatory. Therefore, it simply means na kahit sino ka pa, maputi ka man, pangit ka man, pandak ka man, mataba ka man, this is equal. Next, it is interdependent. The fulfillment of our exercise of one cannot be had without the realizations of the other. Katulad nga nung sa video na pinapanood ko kanina sa inyo, na kapag inalis nila ang karapatan mong magkaroon ng pamumuhay or sariling bahay, anong mangyayari? Sunod-sunod na, di ba? Mawawalan na rin yung right to have your liberty, right to have your own food, ganyan, your freedom, mawawala na siya. So, sinabi nating interdependent, sabi nga niya, one cannot be had without the realization of the other. Sabi nga nila, kapag inuha mo ang isa sa mga basic human rights, anong mangyayari? Maaapektuhan din yung iba mong human rights. So, nakadepende rin siya. Next. So, these are the different types of rights. Okay? Welcome to the different types of rights. So, do you have any questions about the characteristics of human rights? Do you have any questions ba? Now, let's continue. These are the different types of rights na meron tayo. Number 1 is natural rights. Ano ba ang natural rights? Natural rights, these are the God-given rights, acknowledged by everybody to be morally good, unwritten, but prevail as norms of the society. Ano ba yung mga natural rights? Katulad ng right to life. Diba? Meron tayo niyan. Natural rights, ibig sabihin, hindi ginawa ng isang tao. Okay? Actually, binigay na yan ng binigay na yan ng ating Diyos. Sabi nga niya, morally good. Ito na yung mga norms. Next, constitutional rights, okay, conferred and protected by the Constitution, which cannot be modified or taken away by the law-making body. Ang constitutional rights, ito yung nakasaad sa ating Bill of Rights na nakalagay sa Philippine Constitutions in the Article 3. So, kaya nga diba kapag gumagawa ng batas ang isang senador o yung mga manggagawa natin ng mga batas, yung mga legislators natin, ano ang sinasabi? One requirement. Kailangan ang gagawin nilang batas ay hindi po lumalabag sa constitutional rights ng isang bansa. Kasi ito, ang constitutional rights siya ang pinaka-reference sila kapag gagawa sila ng batas. Therefore, tinitingnan yung mga karapatang pangtao. Okay? Tinitingnan nila yung rights ng mga tao kung nalalabag ba sa batas na yun or hindi. Kaya may mga batas na nasususpend or yung parang nare-revoke or nawawalan ng pagkabisa because it is unconstitutionally mandated. Okay? Again, constitutional rights, it is which cannot be modified or taken away by the law-making body. Next, statutory rights. Ano naman itong mga to? So, statutory rights are those rights which are provided by the law, promulgated by law-making body. Ito naman yung mga rights or yung mga batas na ginagawa ng mga legislators natin. So, may mga legislators natin, senators, congressman, congresswoman, pwede rin yung mga local officials natin. Ito yung mga rights na ginawa nila. Okay, so yun ang tawag natin ay statutory rights. For example, gumawa sila ng batas na lahat ng tao ay pwedeng kumain sa park na yun ng libre. Okay, that is a statutory right. Karapatan mong kumain ng libre doon kasi sabi ng batas, pwede kang kumain ng libre doon. Ang mga statutory rights may be abolished, okay, by the body that created them. For example, yung mayor nyo lang na Mayor 1, si Mayor 1 lang yung gumawa ng batas na yon. Pag dumating yung isang mayor, pwede niyang alisin yon or pwede na rin mawala din yon kung sino man ang gumawa ng batas na yon. Yung statutory rights. Again, natural rights, these are the natural rights given from the God. This is our unwritten laws, but normally alam natin karapatan natin yan. Constitutional rights, ito yung mga based from the constitution ng isang bansa. Okay? Ito yung mga nagiging basis bago gumawa ng batas ang isang manggagawa ng batas katulad ng mga senators. Statutory rights, these are the rights, okay, made by the lawmaking body. Sila yung mga, katulad ng example ko nga sa inyo, yung kunwari gagawa sila ng batas pag pwedeng libreng kumain dun sa isang park. Eto. We also have this one. Individual rights versus collective rights. Ano ba ang pinagkaiba? Ang individual rights, from the word itself, individual rights. Karapatan mo yan kahit pang sarili mo lang. Okay? Kahit wala kang kasama, that is individual rights. Meron din tayong tinatawag na collective rights, also called people's rights or solidary rights. For example, freedom of expression, diba? Rights of the society, those that can be enjoyed only in company with others. For example, yung mga union, alam niyo yung mga association ng mga tao, di ba meron silang karapatan na mag-group ng mga association, ganyan. At kung ano man ang rights na binigay sa kanila yon, hindi mo yun magagawa ng pansarili lang unless kasama mo yung mga grupo ng tao na yun. Yun ang tinatawag nating collective rights. Hindi ka na mahirapan. Individual, sa'yo lang. Pwede lang yan sa'yo. Ang collective rights, hindi mo pwedeng gawin ng mag-isa ka lang. Or kung hindi mo kasama, yung mga ibang kagrupo mo na binigyan ng certain rights na ganito. Next, we have also civil rights. Alam niyo ba yung mga civil rights nyo? Anyone? So, napakadali ng civil rights. Rights which the law will enforce at the instance of private individuals for the purpose of securing to them the enjoyment of their means of happiness. For example, your right to have your own property. Right to own a property, that is civil rights. Diba? Karapatan mo bumili ng sakyan. Ayan, civil rights yan. Partake of nature of political rights when they are utilized as a means to participate in the government. Ma'am, sabi mo, meron akong karapatang right to own a property. Eh, bakit yung binili ko, yung bahay sa harap ng Luneta? Ganyan. Pinaalis po nila ako. Ano sabi niya? Partake of the nature of political rights when they are utilized as a means to participate in the government. Kaya may mga, kanwari, road widening. Diba kahit road widening, ang matatamaan nun, yung mga bahay dito sa gilid. Diba? Karapatan nila yon, bahay nila yon. Pero dahil sa batas, okay, gagamitin ng gobyerno, may karapatan ng gobyerno na paalisin sila dun. Babayaran po ba sila? Yes, kung pwede, babayaran sila. Kung merong kasunduan na ganun. Pero kapag nakita nila na sumobra lang itong nagmamay-ari, hindi naman talaga yung sukat ng lupain niya, eh talagang mapapaalis sila dun. Yun ang civil rights natin. This is the enjoyment. This is the enjoyment of our own private life. That is your civil rights. Next is political rights. Okay? Rights Rights which enable us to participate in running the affairs of the government either directly or indirectly. Political rights, ito yung mga karapatan mo rin bumoto or gusto mong maging, tawag dito, yung mga official sa government. That is political rights. Next, economic and social rights. Those which the law confers upon the people to enable them achieve social and economic development. For example, yung magbe-business kayo, magbebenta kayo ng ganito. Social rights, ito yung paano ka mamuhay, ganyan. Pero kadalasan, itong economic and social rights, ang alin, laging naabuso. Lalo na sa economic. For example, tinaasan nila yung presyo ng ganito. Anong mangyari? Lahat na nun. Maapektuhan. So, kapag naapektuhan ito, hindi ka na makabili, hindi ka na makaayon sa buhay mo, mawawalan ka ng trabaho, lahat na nun, sunod-sunod na yan, maapektuhan lahat. Next, we also have the cultural rights. Ano naman ang cultural rights? Rights that ensure the well-being of the individual and foster the preservation, enrichment, and dynamic evolution of national culture based on the principle of unity in diversity in a climate of free artistic and intellectual expressions. Yung cultural rights natin, ito yung karapatan mong mag-develop ng kung ano ang yaman natin. Likas na yaman na pangtao, ha? For example, ayan, evolution of national culture, sabi nga niya. Ano pa? Climate of free artistic and intellectual expression. Ito na yung mga kanara, yung mga katutubo natin, di ba? Ito yung mga arts nila, ito yung yun ang mga culture. May karapatan tayo na ipakita sa kanila or i-express kung ano man ang culture na meron tayo. Kanara, tayo mga Pinoy, o ganito tayo kumain, ganito magbihis yung mga Pinoy, ito ang pag-uugali natin. Ito ang mga tinatawag nating cultural rights. So, we have 3 generations of rights. Okay, first, second, and third. Ibig sabihin ng generation of rights, ito yung pagkakasunod-sunod kung paano ba na-develop ang ating human rights. So, first generation rights. Civil and political rights muna, which derives primarily from 17th and 18th centuries by the reformist theories. It conceives human rights more in negative, freedom from, than positive rights to. Okay. Noong unang panahon, okay, nagkaroon muna tayo ng civil and political rights. And then, sumunod din yung negatives muna. Bago nagkaroon na dapat meron tayong ganito, nilagyan mo na lang freedom from muna siya. Iba kasi yung rights to. Kesa doon sa tinatawag nating freedom from. Freedom from parang makawala ka muna from that abuse. Ang rights to, may karapatan kang gawin ito. Ganun siya. So, more on negatives, parang umaalis muna tayo dun sa more on negatives. Kasi nga, di ba, during 17th and 18th century, wala pa tayong ganun kagandang sistema sa isang bansa sa mga laws niya. So, favors that abstention rather than interventions of government in the exercise of freedoms and in the quest of human dignity. When we say abstention, lagi nilang parang wag na lang gawin. Ganon. Mas pinofocus nila yon yung abstention kesa sa intervention. Pag sinabi naman natin intervention, okay, gawa tayo ng ibang paraan. Hindi sila naghahanap ng another alternative way. Ang ginagawa lang nila is to skip or avoid. Free. Ganon na lang siya. Next, noong second generation rights naman, ito na, pumasok na ang economic, social, and cultural rights. It covers the economic, social, and cultural rights which find their origin primarily in the socialist tradition. It consists of human rights more on positive terms. Dito na papasok yung rights to. Ibig sabihin, may karapatan ka ng magganto. Yan. Fundamental claims to social equality. Meron bang nalilito doon sa freedom from, doon sa rights to? Another ko lang, i-explain ko lang more. Bakit nagiging negative terms kapag sinabi niya na freedom from? For example, binigyan ka ng, lahat ng tao dito lahat ng tao na maitim walang karapatang mabuhay. Ganyan. So, lahat sila ay mamamatay. Ganon. So, So, mangyayari, freedom from that criticism, from that na racism, magkakaroon lang siya ng freedom, o hindi naman lahat. Okay? Hindi porket pangit ka, or hindi porket may team ka, wala ka ng karapatan. Ang positive term is rights to. Ibig sabihin talagang binibigyan ka ng pribilehiyo. Rights to, okay? Rights, you have your own right to have your own work. You have your own right for your transportation. That is your karapatan. Okay? So, second generation rights, ang focus natin, economic, social, and cultural rights. And the last generation rights, okay? This is what we call the solidarity rights. It covers group and collective rights. Hindi lang siya pang individual. Which include inter alia, the right to development, the right to peace, right to clean environment, and to right to self-determination. Freedom of association, ito na yan. Assembly, freedom. Kaya ba may mga liga, bakit may mga asosasyon, ma'am? Ito na yun. Kasi mas lumalawak, dumadami ang ating human rights. So, freedom of association and assembly, freedom of petition, and more especially the freedom to form or join a trade union fall into this category. So, the collective element is even more evident when human rights are linked specifically to membership of certain groups, such as the right of members of ethnic and cultural minorities to preserve their own language and culture. Dito nagkakaroon kasi ng grupo-grupo. Yun ang tinatawag nating third generation rights. Napakadali lang tandaan, di ba? First generation rights, we're talking about the civil rights, the political rights. Second generation rights, ang pinag-uusapan natin dito is about social and economic rights, cultural rights. Third generation, this is what we call the collective rights, di ba? Which tackles the different rights that will give freedom to those who wants to form an association, group, or trade union. So, those are the three generations of rights. Next, so we have different another characteristics of the human rights. Number one is absolute or non-derogable rights. Ano ang tinatawag nating absolute or non-derogable rights? Those that cannot be suspended, nor taken away, nor restricted, limited, even in extreme emergency, even if the government involves national security. Okay? Ito yung absolute. Ibig sabihin, hindi pwedeng kuhanin sa'yo. Okay? Cannot be suspended. Sabi nga niya. For example, diba sa mga bansa, yan, kapag yung president pumunta sa ibang bansa, anong unang-unang gagawin nila? Pinaka-protection ang president. So, that is an absolute or non-derogable rights. Another is derogable or can be limited rights. It may be suspended, restricted, or limited depending on the circumstances which call the preservation of social life. Must satisfy three requirements for it to be valid. Pag sinabi naman natin derogable or can be limited rights, therefore, hindi lahat sakop niya. Kapag sinabi kasi natin absolute, lahat, okay lang. Okay? Pag sinabi naman natin derogable or can be limited, eto, ano yung mga yan? It is provided for the law by which it is made to known to every citizen. Ibig sabihin, yung batas na to kailangan alam lahat ng tao. There is a state of emergency which necessitates the urgent preservation of the public good, public safety, and public moral. And the last one, it does not exceed what is strictly necessary to achieve the purpose. Again, para hindi lang kayo malito, pag sinabi nating derogable or can be limited rights, ito yung mga rights na pwedeng masuspende or magkaroon ng limitations. Sa ating absolute or non-derogable rights, absolutely, completely sa'yo yan at walang pwedeng kumuha nito sa'yo. So, fundamental freedom in political rights. And ito, freedom of conscience and religion. Diba? We have our our own right to choose our own religion. Freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression. Freedom of press and communication. Freedom of association. Freedom of peaceful assembly. Your rights to privacy, reputations, and human dignity. Those fall under the fundamental freedom in political rights. Another, what are the democratic rights? Commonly exercised in a democratic state. Parang tayo, demokratiko ang bansa natin. We have the right to vote and to participate in electoral process. Hindi katulad sa mga ibang bansa kapag monarchy sila, di ba? Kapag monarchy sila, walang pwedeng humabol sa pagka-posisyon. The right to participate in public or governmental affairs. Yan. We also have the mobility rights, the national and international character. We have the right to travel, right to return to one's country, and freedom of movement within the country. Ito ay example ng alin? Ang mobility rights sa panahon ngayon. Pwede siya sa derogable. Tama ba? Diba? Derogable or can be limited rights. Lalo ngayong pandemic. Minsan wala tayong right to travel, diba? Right to return to one's country and the freedom of movement within the country. Next, we also have the right to life, liberty, security of the other persons. So, represents the core of fundamental rights which relate to the right to physical and personal integrity consistent with the human dignity. Example, rights to protections against political and other extrajudicial killings. Kaya nga 'di ba, ano ang sabi? Bawal kang or bawal mong i-administer ang justice sa sarili mong mga kamay. Kaya nagkakaroon tayo ng EGK. Ibig sabihin, hindi po siya dumaan ng tinatawag nating due process of law. So the disappearance of persons and torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. That is why meron tayong right to life, liberty, security of the person. Legal rights, ano naman to? It constitutes due process that can be invoked by persons accused. Ano yan? Freedom from arbitrary arrest and detention. Ibig sabihin, yung hinuli ka ng isang pulis more than doon sa required hours niya. Protection against unreasonable search and seizure. May karapatan kang tumanggi, lalo na kung wala siyang search warrant, diba? Right or warrant of arrest. Your right to counsel. And right to fair in public trial. The presumption of innocence. Yan. And the right against self-incrimination. Or yung sasagutin mo yung mga tanong na pwedeng magsakdal sa'yo. Those are your legal rights. Next, we also have the rights of equality, also known as rights against discrimination. Okay, naalala ko to dito. Pag tinatanong sila sa korte, di ba? Or minsan nagkakaroon ng issue sa mga ganyan eh. Yeah, I invoke my right against ano sinasabi niya? Discrimination. Imbis na rights against self-incrimination. Okay, dapat pagsasagot kayo ng ganito, kapag sa korte or kapag may during interrogation, ito yon. Against self-incrimination, hindi po discrimination. Ang discrimination, ito yung nagkakaroon sila ng prejudice within your race, ganyan, within your culture, within your looks, ganyan. Everyone is equal before the law and is entitled to equal protection or equal benefit of the law. Hindi porket Kapampangan ka, ito lang yung batas sa'yo. Hindi porket taga Manila ka, ito yung batas sa'yo. Protection against discrimination on the grounds of sex, and race, religion, and ethnic origin, age, marital status, and political and social condition. Next, we also have economic, social, and cultural rights. Ano to? Considered moral standards to be observed by the state. Ano yan? Your right to social security, social insurance, protection, and assistance to the family. Mga SSS nyo, mga insurance nyo, may karapatan kayo dyan. Right to an adequate standard of living, the adequate food, clothing, and housing. Madalas na na-violate yan. Next, right to physical and mental health. Right to education. Diba? Right to be part of artistic and scientific life of the country. Anong ang generation to? Yung mga economic, social, and cultural rights. Anong generation yan? That is, madali lang tandaan to. Okay? Makinig lang kayo. Take down notes. Next, you also have workers' rights. Ilang slides ba? Konti na lang. Oh. Last 3 slides. Workers' rights. Ito na yung rights to association. Diba? Yung mga labor union. Rights to organize unions. Right to bargain collectively. Prohibition of forced labor. Lalong-lalo na yan. Kaya nga may batas din dyan. Yung against slavery. Meron din tayong prohibition of employment of children. They have the right age. Ma'am, bakit may artista? Meron po tayong labor code dyan. Or meron tayong batas under the juvenile system kung kung ilang oras lang pwedeng magtrabaho yung bata kung siya ay isang artista. Guarantee of minimum wage and other supports. That is the workers' right. Meron din tayong tinatawag na aboriginal rights. Ano yung aboriginal rights? associated with the rights of indigenous cultural tribes or community. Parang yung mga dito, yung tinatawag nating mga kapatid. Yung mga kapatid nating Aita. Yung huwag nyo silang tatawagin baluga, magagalit sila sa inyo. Ang tawag sa kanila ay kapatid na Aita. Yan. May mga rights yan ha, yung mga indigenous people, under sila ng NCIP, National Community of Indigenous People. At napakadaming rights niyan. Scholar sila, pag nag-aral sila, libre sila sa ospital. Yan, yun yung mga NCIP natin. Minsan nga mapapaisip ka, sana naging Aita na lang ako eh. Bakit? Libre, di ba? Ang dami nilang rights kesa sa mga sa ating, kung tutuusin. Next is reproductive rights. Eto, di ba? Right to found a family and bear children. Wag naman kayong anak ng anak or yung mag-aanak na yung bata pa na. Meron kayong karapatan na bumuhay ng sarili niyong pamilya. Okay? Right to found a family and bear a children. Right to gender sensitivity and the biomedical technology. Kaya nga sa reproductive rights, parang okay lang, di ba, na meron tayong mga iba't ibang genders. Next is right to family planning. Next, we also have the protective rights of persons in armed conflicts during war. Yan. Provided that in the international humanitarian law for the protection of children, women, and non-combatants during internal armed conflicts, kapag nagkakaroon ng gera, number 1 na isinisave dyan ay ang bata. Then, sunod ang mga babae. After nun ay yung mga non-combatants or yung mga civilian. Yan. We also have the rights of self-determination, right of people to be free from the colonial rule, and right of people to decide their own destiny. Next is the last one, the minority group rights, protection of the ethnic and linguistic and religious minorities. Ito yung mga small groups po. So, that's it. That is the introduction of the human rights. So, do you have any questions?